Well, hello, juniors. Day 3 of online school, our second online lecture. Hopefully I'll get better at this as time goes on. Today what you need to do again is take the attendance poll. Then you get to watch this amazing lecture that I'm going to give you today as we go over the study guide for our test. And then you'll have a quiz at the end of today to see how well you've listened to today's lecture. What we'll be doing today is talking about the second part of this section, and then on Monday, instead of listening to me lecture, you'll just have a longer quiz, which will actually be your test for this section. On Tuesday, you'll have to answer another essay question like you did on Thursday, and I'll take those 2 essay questions and then the multiple choice questions that I give you on Monday to make up your test. So we begin today looking at our history as a country and seeing the ways that we've used the concept of race and ultimately set things up to the structure of sin that is evident in the Jim Crow era. We watched the video Race, the Power of an Illusion, which basically tackles the idea of what we think race means scientifically and shows that on a genetic level that race does not mean what we think it means. We can see a big difference between people of different races, but it turns out that those differences are superficial, and when you look at our DNA, you can see that we are incredibly similar as people. Ultimately, race does not tell us about a meaningful difference between human beings. But the video explores the ways that we've treated race as if it did tell us about different kinds of human beings. And as we've treated those differences to be meaningful, we've used them to explain away some of our great injustices that have been a part of our society. Instead of realizing that these injustices are caused by our societal structures, we imagine that these are the way things have to be because of our biological differences. Here's a quote from the first episode that really shows this mindset, talking about kind of what things look like around the year 1900 and the way that race gave us a convenient way to explain away these problems and to think that they are naturalized because that's the way we are designed and made as people. It's at this time that the extinction thesis holds so much weight for a lot of people, as they seem to think that to be a person of color means that you're weaker and that ultimately you would, or your line would die out because of that weakness. Of course, things change when there's finally some prosperity and African Americans are able to not be quite so poor and to have some more opportunities in our society. What happens is we don't lose this mindset, we just come up with a new way of describing superiority and inferiority. That's a big deal with the whole Jesse Owens thing, and how his coach quickly came up with a way of talking about, well, this is why Jesse Owens is fast, but it's a way that paints him in an inferior light. So after talking about the genetics of race and showing that as people we are incredibly similar, and when we have differences, we're apt to find those differences just between any two people, not just between people of different races, it goes then to talk to us about the way that we've thought about what race means, though. And in our class, we looked at some of the ways that these ideas took shape in our history. The Race, the Power of an Illusion series talks about us creating a story. We create, this is what race means, and we really become invested in this story and use it to justify what we do and to explain away what happens. And so, in class, we talked about several big moments when these ideas really sink in. I talked about, the shift in the 1600s away from indentured labor to forced slavery and kind of what happened there. We talk about what we see with Thomas Jefferson and his notes in the state of Virginia. We talk about the use of race to excuse political moves in the early 19th century, and then the bad science of the 19th century. Just to look at a few of those moments more in detail, we talked about the notes in the state of Virginia, in which Thomas Jefferson describes what he observes here in the New World, and as he describes people, he describes the behaviors he sees in African Americans and in Native Americans and compares that to kind of the ideal European. And, based on these activities, these actions that he sees, he concludes that this is evidence for the superiority of the European race, as he calls it. And he attributes the differences to nature, not to society or culture or circumstance. And so we looked at a few of those in class, in the way like he's never seen a slave, who knows much about Euclid, or he's not seen a lot of sculpture, or the way that slaves tend to stay up all night and party, or late into the night and party without saving themselves for the next day. And so he's like, wow, this seems to tell us that, that they must not be very smart, and therefore that they are inferior. And, it's much easier now to look back and find a way better explanation for these things, explanations that tie into circumstance, not genetics or some sort of racial makeup. But Jefferson takes this as evidence about the character, the innate quality, the superiority, ultimately, of people who are European to others. And he sets scientific thought and political thought on the path of the conclusion that clearly different races are different levels of superiority, and many people are going to take that conclusion as a starting point and then just see whatever they see as a way to, quote, prove that conclusion. Another big moment that we see in our history is the way that our politicians seize on this way of thinking and use it as an excuse for some of the decisions they make, decisions that bring nice things for certain people, but also injustice and horrible things for others. And so the way that we treat Native Americans is such a great example of this, how we enter into agreements with them, but ultimately break those agreements and steal from them, and we use race to justify this treatment. Andrew Jackson provides a pretty good statement of this, which is on this next slide. Jackson is justifying the Indian Removal Act, and as he describes Native Americans, you can see that he's basically saying they're inferior, therefore they really don't have rights, they can't actually possess this land or do with the land what we can do, and so therefore it's fine if we take this land from them. And this really typifies this way of using race to say, well, we have great ideas, we believe in all men were created equal. We believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But these folks aren't men. These folks aren't capable of that. And so it's fine if our structures kind of, abuse and take advantage of them because they're less than who we are as Americans. We also talked about the way that science kind of throws its hat into this way of thinking. And, as scientific thought is flexing its new muscles, there's just this idea that, well, they can look at race and they can prove through the idea of race that the way things are designed to be, the way things are supposed to be, because certain races are clearly superior to other races. And so, scientific thought basically just runs with this and comes up with all sorts of nefarious ways to prove that certain races are superior and certain races are inferior. And looking back, it's pretty easy to see that their biases, these scientists, and the systematic errors they make and crazy, wild conclusions they make based on some pretty silly stuff. But because, science is kind of new to the scene and doing amazing things, a lot of this seems like gospel truth to many. But again, looking back, it's easy to see how flawed it was. I always like to think of that statement they make in the video about the scientists who are, looking at all the races of people and coming to conclusions about who's superior and who's inferior. And so he talked about how the American scientists, they do all this study, they go, guess what? American people are the most superior people in the world. And then, under them are English and French and others. And at the bottom are Africans. And English scientists were doing the same thing. But they discovered, lo and behold, that English people are the most superior people in the world, followed by the French and the Americans and others, with Africans on the bottom. And French scientists, well, they discovered that French people are superior, with Americans and English and others below, but also with Africans on the bottom. And just thinking about that, basically everybody goes in thinking they're superior, and unfortunately thinking that Africans are inferior, and they basically skew what they look at and contort what they look at to fit that conclusion that they started with. I'm no scientist, but I know you guys can tell me that that's bad science. Anyway, what it results in is a certainty among all the power players in the United States that race tells us about superior and inferior beings. And this is the type of thinking that leads to the infamous Dred Scott decision that says that Africans aren't capable of being citizens of the United States in 1857. And unfortunately, even people who are fighting against slavery are often buying into this mentality. So there's that moment, that the advisor of President Lincoln, Agassiz, he says, well, be careful, but the rights you give to these newly freed slaves, they are incapable of living on an equal footing with white America. And so, like, even as he's doing this humane thing, looking to end slavery, there's this feeling that, well, still we're talking with people who are less than men, and so sure, treating them like slaves is bad, but obviously we don't want to give them rights like everyone else. And so this is a huge deal, that even when slavery is defeated, the justifications for slavery remain, and that sets the table for what comes next.
After the Civil War, we have Civil War amendments, notions of inferiority, retrenchment and resentment, political realities, government actions, Jim Crow era, structure of sin, a time for justice, breaking the structure.
And so in this time after the Civil War, you have people who are very much vested in the idea of inferiority, some people working to give rights to African Americans, but others working to keep the status quo, and ultimately we know how that ends up. The Civil War amendments were passed in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, and they were attempts to give status and protection to African Americans, but unfortunately, as we talked about, they were laden with loopholes. There's 3 of those amendments. The 13th abolishes slavery. The 14th does 2 things. It says if you're born here, you're a citizen, and it also tries to ban discrimination by making sure the state cannot take away the rights of citizens or deprive anyone of their rights without due process. And the 15th Amendment said that the right to vote cannot be taken away based on previous condition of servitude or race or color. And so these amendments were attempts to basically, end slavery and give free slaves a status as citizens, and to make sure that these citizens were now able to participate fully in our society without discrimination. One other thing that the government was able to do is it passed a Civil Rights Act in 1875. And in it, it kind of takes the 14th Amendment one step further and just lists all kinds of specific activities and says that they are illegal, that you can't discriminate in all these ways. And as we see, unfortunately, this is going to get struck down after the Compromise of 1877. So those were some things that were trying to help African Americans have some status, but there are other things that happened that worked against this and ultimately brought those ideas down. So first, as I've talked about already, these notions of inferiority were around, and people were not willing to let go of this. And so even as slavery ends, the notions that underpin slavery don't go away, and the arguments will shift from justifying slavery and slavery to now justifying discrimination and segregation. In addition, there's a lot of people who wanted to keep the status quo, who thought that the system of second-class citizenship for people of color was the way it should be. And so even when slavery was gone, they wanted to keep something like that in place. And the black codes passed by the southern states right after the Civil War are a great kind of vivid example of this. And then, another thing that's happening is there's a lot of resentment about the government, resentment about people having others interfere in their lives and intrude on their way of life and their values. I mentioned the Black Codes. Those are laws passed by all the former slaves kind of in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, and they are clear examples, attempts to keep black people in their place, unfortunately. And it's just crazy to see, like, and we talked about some of them, about you had to work an entire year, and if you left your job you lost a year's work, and you could be arrested for not working, and you had to address your boss as master, just crazy things like that. At that point, the federal government is still strong enough and steps in and forces the southern states to repeal those laws, but it just shows the mentality that's there. Another big deal is the political realities that took shape, after the assassination of Lincoln, when Johnson was president. There just this eagerness to kind of get things back the way they were, and not a lot of real appreciation for what was going to be created when they did this. By ultimately, they re-empowered a lot of the people who had been empowered before the Civil War, and those people are the ones who are very much invested in trying to keep things the way they were. And so to get anything done on a federal level, you needed a lot of agreement. And so you were turning to these people in the South who had their own ideas, and basically you needed them to be on board with you to get something done. And so they're able to kind of make certain demands, and eventually it affect the election of 1877 in such a way that the federal government makes an agreement to leave the South and to end Reconstruction. And once pressure from the federal government is gone, then things quickly move in the South and in other places in the country too, to establish a system of segregation and to really enact and make society look like these ideas that people have in terms of inferiority and superiority. And so we talked about the ways that the amendments that were passed in the Civil War era, how unfortunately they have these huge loopholes that make this possible. The 15th Amendment, the one that's trying to give voting rights to everyone, that has the loophole that says that you can't deny the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but pretty much any other reason you can think of is a valid reason to keep somebody from voting, or at least it's not against the Constitution. And so states began passing laws that made it more and more difficult for undesirables to vote. And the most famous restrictions were poll taxes and literacy tests, and those were used in conjunction with the first grandfather clause, the idea that if your grandfather voted, then you are automatically eligible to vote. Speaking of grandfather clauses, I brought in an expert. Ella, what do you think a grandfather clause is?
The grandfather clause?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, you have another expert? Excuse me, sir, please walk over here. Quickly. Benjamin, what is a grandfather clause?
A grandfather clause is a grandfather who voted.
Very good, thank you. Excellent work. Thank you, experts. Okay, just a reminder of other things the government did to kind of create the Jim Crow era. First off, the Supreme Court in 1883 ruled that the Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional. It argued that the 14th Amendment applied to states only, to the government only, and so what private individuals did could not be legislated. And then in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation is okay so long as separate but equal facilities were provided. And, with the first one, basically 1883, they basically cleared the way for private individuals to discriminate, which led to all sorts of segregation in all sorts of public places, as long as they weren't run by the government. And then in 1896, the government could segregate as long as they paid lip service to this idea of separate but equal. And as we talked about in class, there were lots of separate after that and not a lot of equal. And then that led to basically, starting in 1890 and onward, basically the states were left to be able to create laws that enforce segregation and basically set up two different structures of citizenship in the United States. What was available for people who were white and what was available for people of color. And, that basically, at that point, we have a Miss Eliot's classroom. We have a situation where people are told that to be white is to be superior, to be black is to be inferior, and there were all sorts of privileges that came with being white that were not afforded to people of color. And, of course, different people benefited and suffered from these in different ways. But basically, you had decades then of this being in place. And, a lot of people believe this is the way things were supposed to be. Unfortunately, a lot of people of color would internalize that and really struggle and deal with that themselves. And it really, it created a world that, we had, like I say, kind of two different levels of citizenship available. And as I say, the connection to social justice is this is a clear example of a society-wide sinful structure. And in social justice circles, we talk about structures of sin or social sin, when a sin gets to be kind of written into the way a society works, embedded into the very fabric of society. And, these come about because of lots of choices by the individuals, sinful choices by people. But at some point, those choices kind of take on a life of their own and become just the normal way of doing things. And the people who are caught up in these structures, they don't even realize a lot of times, not necessarily, that they're doing something wrong. What might seem odd and unusual is to actually care for others and to fight against these structures. And it's a good time when we talk about structures of sin to be reminded of what we talk about with the common good. Common good is when you basically have structures that try to benefit everyone and make it possible for everyone to have the possibility and opportunity to flourish. In a structure of sin, quite often what happens is some people are getting their needs met and really think that everything is great, but it's at the expense of others who are not being treated with dignity and who do not have the opportunities to flourish and to live life as designed. And so, a social justice class, we're really kind of drawn to this as our focus, this idea of a structure of sin and how, we can find lots of examples of a structure of sin. But for us in the United States, for sure, one that has just been kind of with us, unfortunately, for so long is the structure of racism. And this is why I showed you the video, A Time for Justice, just to see, when finally things are able to, there starts to be a change in the 1950s and 1960s, and people are standing up for rights and defying some of these unjust laws, we can see how those laws were, and we can see how the society looked at that time, and the ways in which people were very much invested in keeping things that way. And so there's just so many examples of the structure of sin that was present in our society at that time. Now, we had an assignment last week where I asked you to list some examples of a structure of sin, what we saw, and things you could see are, the things that, the segregations that were there. You can see kind of the effects in terms of where people lived or what was possible for where people could live. But then you could see it in the social structures, like the juries and who could vote and who couldn't vote. You can see it in the ways people protested in response to protest, and the ways that people were treated as they tried to stand up for their rights. The people who were beat up at the lunch counters or riding the buses, and then who was arrested after that. So many examples of the structure of sin on display. Okay, folks, that's the end of the lecture for today. Don't forget that you have a quiz to take, so please make sure that you do that. And I'm going to throw in one extra question on the quiz. That is, the question is going to be, what is Benjamin's middle name? Benjamin, say hello.
My middle name.
Say hello. Benjamin, what is your middle name?
My middle name is Xavier.
Xavier, or as I would say, Xavier. Very good. All right, y'all have a great day. Benjamin, anything you want to say to the class?
No.
Wait, nothing? Anything at all?
Bye-bye.
All right, y'all have a great day. Adios.